Hello, I'm recording this lesson just in case some of you do not attend the live lesson on Monday, or if your class is not slightly following my timetable. But hopefully many of you will get the opportunity to prepare to write your analysis of To Autumn with your class teacher live. So we're going to revise mimesis. Think about what mimesis is referring to and why does Darker use mimesis, or sorry, what that should be. What does Darker use mimesis to present in living space? So think about how she uses mimesis. What does that mimesis represent in living space? Last lesson, when we annotated To Autumn, we looked at what an elegy was. In what way is To Autumn an elegy? Can you pause the video, please, and answer those two questions? So, our new word, or even though I mentioned it in the video last lesson, is cyclical. Now, this simply refers to something that is recurrent, that occurs in cycles. So think about this cycle of life and death. Think about this cycle of the seasons. And we know that in To Autumn, you know, he presents nature as this cycle, and this cycle of nature that is recurrent, that is never ending, that is eternal, refers to the cycle of a human lifespan. So pause the video now and jot down that definition. So think about then, how is nature cyclical? Cyclical, can't say it at the moment. So think about what I've just said. Have a go now at answering that question. So mimesis is when something about the structure of the poem mimics or copies something about the poem itself. In living space, Darker uses the line, the whole structure leans dangerously, and structurally it leans, it's the longest line in that poem and it leans over the side of the poem. What she's using that to represent is the structure of the slums themselves, and again, the potential danger that exists, which is then later focused on with the metaphor of the people being these fragile eggs living in this space. An elegy is a poem with a very sad, very mournful tone. Elegies are often written, you know, to do with the dead. To Autumn is an elegy because essentially it is about this cycle of life, and the poem ends with sort of autumn into winter, representing this idea of the slow and gradual and inevitable passage into death of a human being. Now, whether that death is 25, like poor John Keats himself, or whether, you know, this death is 100 at 103, we know that it is eventually an inevitability for us all, which is, of course, this idea To Autumn is exploring. So nature is cyclical because it goes in circles. You know, winter is not the end. Winter will go into spring, spring to summer, summer to autumn, autumn to winter, and then the whole thing begins again. And he is very much representing this cycle of life, cycle of the seasons in To Autumn. So the purpose of today's lesson is to prepare you to do a 20-minute analysis like you did last week on London by William Blake, but this time you're going to be writing about how Keats presents nature or ideas about nature in To Autumn. So you're going to think about what quotations you could use to analyse or evaluate, if you're aiming for the top grades, how nature is presented in the poem. Why does Keats choose to present nature in this way? And again, knowing we always have to refer to the context, how does this link to not just Keats's beliefs as a romantic poet, but also his personal life as well? So pause the video and jot that down, the knowledge goal. So the question that you will be answering, not today, but in the lesson tomorrow, how does Keats present nature in To Autumn? And we know in the exam, when you're asked to write about the first poem, you have 20 minutes in order to do so. We know that you must start with a brief overview, summarising how nature is presented. Then you track through the poem from start to finish, analysing how nature is presented. Now, we know in 20 minutes that you can, as individuals, write, a different amount. Some of you may be able to get to sort of 3 quotations in 20 minutes, some of you 4 or 5 or even more. Now, we know that coverage is really important in this exam. We know that you need to try and write as much about the poem as you possibly can in 20 minutes, but we also know that this is something we will gradually build up to, and you will improve your coverage as we practice more and develop that skill. So what you need to do is look at your annotation of the poem and at least pick 1 quotation from each of those 3 stanzas. That shows how nature is presented. If you're aiming again for the higher grades, or you're someone that can write a little bit more, you might want to pick a couple of short quotations from each of the stanzas. So what I'd like you to do is pause the video, spend about 5 minutes looking back at your annotations from last lesson. Think about quotations that you feel comfortable writing about, that you can analyse to really think about how is Keats presenting autumn here, and more importantly, a quotation that you can link to, why is Keats choosing to present nature in this way? How does that link to his beliefs as a romantic poet, or how does that link to something about his personal life? Ignore the bit at the top of the PowerPoint about a grid. We're not going to focus on that. I simply want you to select your quotations, write them down, and then explode them in your books. Remember, exploding your quotation is underlining the key word, the crucial word that's giving you your impression, and then just making some notes. By exploding your quotations, you really help yourself when you come to write your mini PEs and your analysis, because you've already done that sort of thinking about the effect of the word. So pause the video now, spend about 5 minutes doing that, please. So just to remind you then, now you've found your evidence, we begin with our overview. We summarise how nature is presented in the poem. You have your quotation, or more than one, if you're selecting that from stanza 1, then stanza 2, and then stanza 3. So we know that we always write about the poem from start to end. So here is an example of a mini PE then. We're going to read it together, and I want you to think about how this could be improved. Why is this not really following the technique we teach you in how to write a nice, succinct, straightforward mini PE? Into autumn, Keats is telling us that autumn is a time which is good because the fruit is very ripe. I can see this when he says, season of mist and mellow fruitfulness. So just have a little think. What is the problem with writing a mini PE that looks like this? So hopefully you've realised several things here. Firstly, this person's quotation is far too long. When you write a quotation that is that long, your analysis is going to be a little bit vague, because what you are not able to do is really identify what word in particular is giving you that impression and how. Now here, the word that is giving the impression of ripeness is not season of mist or mellow, it is fruitfulness. So there is no need to include any other word other than fruitfulness here. The rest of the quotation is pointless because it's not linked to the impression, the point that this person is making. They also have the technique wrong because we have the quotation, your one-word quotation, your short quotation at the start of your mini PE, embedded into your sentence. So the rest of your sentence is then analysing how that word presents nature or gives you your impressions. So here is one written in a more familiar technique to you, hopefully. When Keats uses the adjective fruitfulness, it effectively suggests autumn as a time of plenty, Because, and remember, every mini PE you ever write should always have the word because in, because it creates an image of ripe, juicy fruit that is ready to be picked. Now that is far more succinct, that is far more focused in its how, in its analysis, simply because they have embedded that one word quote in the sentence near the start. However, there is something missing potentially, and that is the context. Now, you do not necessarily have to write about the context for every point or quotation that you make. You need to ensure that you have written about the context for at least half of your mini PEs. So if you're only writing 3, 2 of those need to link to the context. But you want to focus on the context and embed the context into as much of your analysis as you can, because you are marked on it. So the improvement, if I was marking this as a student's work, I would be writing R8 next to it, which we know is our marking code for context. You need to add in some context here. So we're going to have a look at 2 model overviews and first mini PE. Now again, these lessons are aimed at all of the sort of classes, but we appreciate that you will be aiming for a wide range of grades. So what I've done is I've got 2 overviews, like last week when we looked at London. I have one aiming around a grade 5, and then I have one aiming around a sort of 7. Okay, so you can use the model that you feel is more appropriate or more accessible to you to help you. So here's my overview. Into autumn, Keats uses the season of autumn to effectively present the cycle of life and death represented by the seasons. So we know this is something we spoke about. He uses nature through the seasons to present the cycle of life and death. Keats could have been inspired to reflect on the cycle of life and death through nature due to his own ill health at a young age, as well as the early losses of close family members. Now, we also know that Keats was ill when he wrote this poem, and we know that he lost his mother, father, and brother. So death and grief and loss is something that he experienced a lot of. So now I have my first mini PE. When Keats describes autumn as a time of fruitfulness, it suggests autumn is a time of plenty because it creates an image of ripe, juicy fruit that is ready to be picked, which could represent the time in life where a person is healthy and in their prime. Now, that is all taken from the annotation that we did yesterday, which is why we always say to you, make sure your annotation is detailed. If you don't do the annotation, you're not able to use that annotation to support you when you come to do this sort of analytical writing. This links to the context because Keats had just fallen ill when he wrote this poem, so he could be thinking back to a time where he was well and healthy. So that is, you know, a very decent mini PE. We have the short quote, we've analysed the sort of image, and, you know, what really pushes this to being a good mini PE is I've spoken about what it could represent, this idea of a life cycle. And equally, I've linked it to the context. So, you know, this is sort of pushing a high 5, really. So, again, looking at a grade 7 then. Into autumn, Keats uses the season of autumn to effectively present the cycle of life because he begins with a reference to the plentiful harvest at the start of autumn and ends with the season moving to winter, where many natural things die. Keats could have been inspired to reflect on the cycle of life and death through nature due to his own ill health at a young age, as well as the early losses of close family members. Now, it's quite similar to the grade 5 example, but just slightly more detailed. When Keats uses the adjective fruitfulness, it effectively suggests autumn is a time of plenty because it creates an image of ripe, juicy fruit that is ready to be picked. Additionally, he uses verbs such as plump and budding to exaggerate the ripeness of the fruit, which is effective because he could also be using this to represent the time in life when a person is healthy and in their prime. Interestingly, Keats could be using this stanza to reflect on a time from his younger years where he felt positive and healthy, as opposed to how he was feeling when he wrote the poem, that should be, sorry, not wrote the poem, becoming ill with tuberculosis. Now, again, the difference that we see here is it's just demonstrating a greater depth of knowledge and analysis, bordering, it's not, you know, fantastically evaluative, but it's bordering on evaluative as well, and again linking into the context. Now you will know which model is more appropriate for you to use based on your target grade. So when you're writing your analysis next lesson, do please feel free to open this video back up and have these models in front of you to help. So what are the sorts of things you need to include then? We know you need to make sure you have a short embedded quote. You know you need to analyse how the word has given you your impression, of nature, not of war. I don't know why that says war. So how the word has given you your impression of nature. We know we need to include contextual information. If you are aiming for the higher grades, we know that your analysis needs to be more in depth, more insightful, more perceptive for, you know, the 8s and 9s, bordering on original. We know you can do that through considering multiple interpretations, multiple ways of interpreting and analysing that quote, and also being evaluative. You know, think about the effectiveness of the poet's use of language or the success of their intentions. So before we go, if you are doing this lesson and it wasn't done during a live lesson, so if you're watching this video, it is because you didn't do this in your live lesson and you are stuck or struggling with what quotations to pick, firstly, do please email your class teacher if you need some extra support. But what you should have attached to your assignments when you come to plan and then when you come to write is a writing frame that does include some quotations to support you. Now, only use the writing frame if you feel you need it, but it is there as a support to help you, obviously, in these difficult times when we're not doing this in class and your teacher isn't there to give you that immediate support. So finally, just to end, I'd like you just to summarise, because it would be good to include in your essay, how to autumn is an elegy. So just write a sentence summarising that, and then it's the end of the lesson. See you next time.